ntateng ya phetogo ya loapi ke nagano le tshepiso masilonyana go tswa kwa lekaleng la Botswana Climate Change Network ke gore tlhalosetsa ka tirisanyo mmogo ya makalana le dithulaganyo tsa senela ruri tse di ka rarabollang phuduga e ya batho ka ntlha ya phetogo ya loapi re sotla ke sebaka se ke go dibedise ke go amogele mo Botswana Television. Alright, a re simolola puisong ya re ka gore o re tlhalosetse ka pego ya Global Center for Climate Change gore e bua e reng ka this 30,000 people ba ile gore ba tla bo ba huduga le ba kaileng.
Gone ke nnete report e supa ha ile gore re solohetse mo Botswana gore ka ntlheng ya phetogo ya seemo sa loapi e ba kwang ke khotelo ya loapi tota. The reports show that mo Botswana khotelo ya loapi has been up to 1.5 degrees, and we're expecting it to go up to 2 degrees Celsius since about the 1900s, right? And so report the isupa hela ya lo gore me phetogo ya seemo sa loapi has stresses or impacts things like agricultural productivity le botsogo jwa batho me go solohela gore because of some pressures tse ileng gore dita ama batho these will push people to move out of where they are, the communities in which they live. And this report particularly looks at Botswana and estimates that about 29,600 Botswana will be moved out of their homes, their communities, to other places. What the report does is also help us identify hotspots, right? The report identifies out-migration hotspots. Community at the top of that list communities Good Hope, Kanye, Lemau, and these communities are particular out-migration hotspots because climate change, affects things like water scarcity, metsi a ka tswang le teng ka diriswa ke batho anwa ke batho diriswa le ke balemi ba rui jalo jalo metsi tshwana le bo maung e leng gore go magomediwa ke issues like flooding and sometimes long-term droughts that make agriculture for a lot of rural communities quite impossible. And so we're expecting a lot of movement, outward movement of people from these communities. But the report does well to also identify, in-migration hotspots. Where do we expect these people to be going, according to projections? And what the report has found is we're expecting, obviously urban communities like Gaborone at the top of that list, Lobatse, and even Mopane are urbanized to receive a lot of this, inward migration, particularly because of climate change. And the reason why that is because of the services, that support, socio-economic livelihoods. Water services available, availability of jobs. And what we're seeing is, proximity to economic centers will be a huge influencer in inward migration. And what this tells us is, one, climate change is pushing people away from highly climate vulnerable communities. Mitseneke mentioned Yabo Maung, the Ngamiland district, Le Mitsi Kako Burulung, Good Hope. They are highly vulnerable. They are some of the most climate vulnerable communities, Botswana. And what we're seeing is a migration towards where we're seeing climate resilient infrastructure and services available, or at least services that enable climate resilience. And so I think it's quite a good report in that it allows us to preempt and to plan what the impacts of climate change will be in human development, and how we can prepare and preempt our planning for that human migration.
Most definitely. You really answered the whole interview. But you partly answered the question the heat wave
Tota go ntse jalo, it's because of climate pressures. Available data ga re le ka go lebela ko pele a ke re kana go ha ke go lebela ko pele go bona gore phetogo a seemo sa loapi ya go rama yang se e leng gore ra se hitlhela when making the projections. Available projections prove that we expect average temperatures in Botswana to go up by up to 6.2 degrees by the end of the century. That's about 80 years. That's just a generation away, get up from me. 6 degrees. We're expecting, average summer temperatures to reach as high as 43 degrees. This is not letsatsi le long gore gona le heat wave be re temperature ile go 43. These are average summer temperatures going up to 43 degrees Celsius. We are expecting average days of heat spell, right? The heat wave to about 240 days in a year. That's about 3/4 of the year. Re temogela mogote e leng gore o heteletse akere se leng gore gona na re se bitsa ile heat wave ka gore kana a wave says it comes and it comes and dubuela manno about the end of the century. We're expecting about 3/4 of the year to be the equivalent of what we call a heat wave. And now we're also expecting 130 days of dry spell, of drought. Malatse e leng gore re ke a luba hela mo ngwageng ga re itemogele pula. And some of these things ke tsone tse ileng gore re solehela gore ke tsone tse ileng gore will be the key drivers driving people, especially from rural farming communities out of where they are, because phetogo ya seemo sa loapi e tla ira gore botshelo, especially for farming communities bo nna bokete. Even finding economic pathways for making a living.
Most definitely.
You'd know that multidimensional poverty in rural communities stands at about 30%. The national average is about 17%. And so poverty, especially in rural communities, it's one driving people to look for better opportunities in more urban settlements.
All right. Now, but I wanted to ask a lot more questions, but what is the difference?
The thing with climate mobility and looking at climate mobility is they're looking for economic opportunities. A majority of the economic migration, particularly in the context of Botswana, is influenced actually by climate change and how by PISA, the current work that's being pushed by the Global Center for Climate Mobility. Mobility o ilong gore o drive ke climate change mele mobility o ilong gore is economically driven. There's a relationship, and so that perhaps could say to us gore economic migration could be as a result of climate change. But if we were to particularly look at the difference between climate mobility and things like mobility or migration due to conflict or the economic conditions that a particular community, sometimes climate mobility is very sudden. Unlike a political migration where you're simply moving because of
plan also
you have to plan, right? So with that you have time to plan and consider, where am I going? Who do I know there? Can I get a job? Secure a job before I go there? But sometimes with climate change is you are completely displaced. It is unplanned and it is very immediate, and you're left with no option. Just hela mo Gaborone, we had a lot of homes where families had to move. And by nightfall, and so that's the I think main difference with climate mobility is sometimes it's sudden, it's unplanned, but paying attention to it at this level, at the national level, means we can maybe preempt and have, structures and systems in place so that in the instance that, natural disasters happen, our response, it doesn't catch us off guard.
Most definitely. Now, we had an example, Los Angeles. We have seen the wildfires that ravaged the whole city, and we have seen the authorities move out of these places because disaster is coming. There were those who chose to stay. And tota
mo Botswana, that issue ke re bitsang climate mobility, e-mobility, right? Gore le ha no batlile go suta ha o leng teng ga o khone. Maybe primarily because your household economics do not allow you to move anywhere. You have a connection to your community, and we expect e-mobility tata mo Botswana to be in rural communities. Poverty, multidimensional poverty, is godimo than the national average, and so what. Again, us preempting, climate mobility is we are then able to identify, high-risk communities where they are, and inculcate considerations for climate immobility in disaster risk reduction or even our response. How do we accommodate for immobility? Yeah.
Right now, because we understand that people moving from different places in a certain place, it might come with its own disadvantages. What could be done to make sure that we are evenly distributed across the country, not that we move to certain places, maybe because, yes, you have already mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, that maybe because of the services or the infrastructure allows that you withstand the change of the climate?
Yep. Well, what we are getting from the climate mobility report so far is, under certain economic conditions, we're expecting more people to be moving around, and sometimes that mobility, right, is good. Enabling mobility, right, is good, because they're either fleeing, a natural disaster or looking for better, economic opportunities, and that's a thing that we should actually enable. And so enabling mobility is something that we encourage as a climate response, and as part of adaptation we should be able to plan for or include in our adaptation response how we enable people's mobility in the instance of a climate related shock, right? And moving away from our planning from a response or a reactive approach to one that is focused on planning and preempting. Early warning systems, and we're expecting that as technology progresses, we'll be able to enable early warning, so that people know when to move ahead of time.
Right. Now, the Paris Agreement or the UN's Global Impact on Migration,
what we are seeing with the Paris Agreement is climate mobility is increasingly becoming an issue of importance as different COPs come in and the agreements strengthen or they focus in on particular issues. And what I think has been important is you'd recall last year in Azerbaijan, developed countries agreed to triple their commitment, financial commitment to support developing countries, the shocks that climate change, from 100 billion to 300 billion every year by 2035. And so we think, focusing in now on climate mobility, it then means we can align national planning and our disaster response with tse ileng gore di letla gore mahatshe a sentseng a tlhabologa ka Botswana a ka bona thuso ya madi gore re ka ipaakanya, whether we're talking about our policy response or actually urban infrastructure and improving urban infrastructure so that people in communities like Maung don't have to move because they're more habitable, or people in communities like Kanye is generally an urbanized community, but if we can improve water access there, just fixing that will drastically change the mobility pressures in a community like Kanye, and our ability to access international global climate finance through the Paris Agreement. Climate change.
Unfortunately, we are running clean out of time. We have to wrap up the conversation. We've got 3 minutes. Now, is there any stronger, you talked about policy, adjustment or improvements in Botswana. After the disaster that we had, the floods, people had nowhere to go. The assistance came late, or even the response to the access to the information as to what going to happen. What should be done in order to help people during these disastrous times?
A lot can be said about what we could have done differently, but I think at the crux of everything is how we coordinate action, especially in relation to climate change more Botswana. And so it boils down to climate governance Botswana, and we've always said at the Botswana Climate Change Network that we need to elevate the climate change mandate more Botswana so that we coordinate better. And currently on the policy end, climate policy coordination is underfunded and under-resourced. It's under a unit in a department of the ministry, and so we need to elevate the climate change mandate so that we get the right response. We have the policies actually. We have a climate change policy of 2021. We have a climate change strategy and action plan with detailed actions for maphata harologaneng a government. We have an NDC now with an associated budget as well, but unfortunately none of our strategies are funded, or there's no modality for funding our climate change preparedness or our response, and that's where we should start.
Most definitely. Unfortunately, we have run clean out of time. We have to go to the 7 o'clock news, but thank you so much for your insights. I believe as we are reeling out of the floods, we have to pay attention to these reports and make sure that we prepare in advance, as you've already mentioned. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
And wait, reba kutlo teng happy senyarane ke nahano le tshepiso masilong yana go sa kwa Botswana Climate Change Network gore tlhalosetsa jalo ka tirisano mmogo ya makalana le dithuso tsa senela ruri tse di ka rarabolla mphuduga ya batho e leng gore e tla jana e bakiwa ke phetogo ya loapi o se ka ba suita ke a bua ka dikgantsana go ya bosupa.
Urgent and robust investments are needed in power generation, transmission and diversification into renewable energy sources such as wind,